In this lesson, we're going to discuss the different evidence for evolution. At the end of this video lesson, you should be able to enumerate some pieces of evidence of the occurrence of evolution. The theory of evolution may not be easily accepted by many individuals for many reasons. One of the most popular arguments about the refusal of this theory is creationism. This is the religious belief that nature, and aspects such as the universe, earth, life, and humans originated with supernatural acts of divine creation. It is backed up by the idea that life on earth has remained the same forever since the earth's existence. However, the scientific community argues that evolution, although being a theory, is a fact that organisms have changed, transformed, or evolved through the course of time. It still remains as a theory because of the lack of vast pieces of concrete evidence to justify its truthfulness. A theory like this may be difficult to prove because most of the evidence it needs existed during the prehistoric Earth, the time when people have not been existing yet to argue that it's happening even at the slowest rates. The most justifiable evidence for evolution that we don't have much today are the fossil records. Fossil records show that past organisms differed from living organisms, that many species have become extinct, and that species have evolved over long periods of time. Typical land creatures were the ancient whale descendants, the Pachycetus. They had long skulls and big carnivorous teeth. They don't look like whales at all from the outside. However, their skulls, especially in the ear area, which is covered by a bony wall, are very similar to those of live whales and are distinct from any other mammal. Rhodocetus has evolved from the dog-like whale ancestor Pachycetus for a few million years. A larger four-legged mammal, which spent most of its time on water and not on land, though its play-footed posture demonstrates that Rhodocetus was capable of walking, or at least dragging itself along a solid ground for short periods of time. The hip bones of Rhodocetus were not completely integrated into the backbone, as a further proof of the increasingly aquatic life of the ancient whales of the early Eocene period, allowing greater stability while you were swimming. When whales started swimming using the entire body, other skeleton improvements caused their limbs more to be used to steer than to paddle. The sequence of the tail vertebrae of these whales resemble those of the living dolphins and whales, or early whales. Basilosaurids like Dorodon had particularly prominent changes in the skeleton to fit an aquatic lifestyle. They could secure their elbow joints so that the forelimb could be used as a stronger control pad and withstanding the oncoming water flow while the animal was propelled. Their hind legs are almost non-existent. This gave rise to the genus Balena or the baleen whale. As we can see from the evolution of the baleen whale, its hind limbs become non-functional and seem to be non-existent. This is a feature of comparative anatomy, wherein we can see the differences of the structures and functions between related organisms. In the case of the baleen whale, its hind limb is an example of a vestigial structure. Vestigial structures are anatomical features or behaviors that no longer seem to have a purpose in the current form of an organism of the given species. In the case of humans, some vestigial structures are the following. First, the wisdom tooth. With the evolution of our jaw, it became too short to fit easier our wisdom teeth, which are also known as our third molars. The wisdom teeth are no longer beneficial since we have shifted our diet to soft food through the process of cooking. Second, the appendix. The human appendix can be regarded as a vestigial organ since it has been shown that the removal of the organ after childhood does not do any damage. Lastly, the tailbone or coccyx. Obviously, people no longer have noticeable external tails, so people do not need tails in trees like human ancestors did. The coccyx actually acts as a muscle anchor. That wasn't its original intent, so that's why it's known to be vestigial. In other evolutionary lines, anatomical parts of related organisms do not lose their functions. Rather, they just evolve by having different functions. These are called homologous structures. These are physical structures of the organisms that have the same evolutionary origin and positions but different in function. For example, the bones from the shoulder to the tips of the finger of all mammalian species, including humans, dogs, birds, and whale, indicate that the roles of these appendages are very different: lifting, walking, flying, and swimming. Another classification in comparative anatomy is analogy. Analogous structures are structures that are similar in unrelated organisms. The structures are similar because they evolved to do the same job in the same environment, or they experience the same or similar selective pressures, not because they were inherited from a common ancestor. Aside from fossil records and comparative anatomy, evolution can be evidenced by the embryonic development of vertebrates. If you were asked to identify what organism are the following embryos, you may have a hard time to name this. Even after some stages of development, it would be very difficult to distinguish each vertebrate. But when looking at the latter stages of prenatal development, we can already identify the following organisms. This makes embryology an evidence for evolution. This means that the indistinguishable characteristics of vertebrate embryos are results of shared common ancestry. Lastly, it would be very important to look for evidence on the genetic level, since evolution happens due to the changes in allele frequencies. Despite the great diversity of life on our planet, the simple language of the DNA code is the same for all living things. To understand how genetics becomes an evidence for evolution, let us look at the number of amino acids that differ from a human hemoglobin polypeptide. The human hemoglobin polypeptide has 146 amino acids. Lampreys differ in 125 amino acids, 67 in frogs, 45 in chickens, 27 in mice, and 8 in rhesus monkeys. These data tell us that the smaller the number of amino acid difference with each other, the closer or more related the two organisms are with each other. This means that we are more closely related to rhesus monkeys than to mice, than to chickens, than to frogs, and we are related the least to lampreys. These pieces of evidence give us information that evolution is really happening even if we don't witness it with our naked eyes. To conclude this lesson, let us review the following key points. Fossil records show how living organisms are related to ancient organisms using the differences of their anatomical parts. Comparative anatomy includes vestigial structures, homologous structures, and analogous structures. Embryology provides evidence that vertebrates are related to each other. And lastly, genetics provides evidence that organisms have the same genetic language. And that ends our discussion on the evidence for evolution.